Boyd says, hey, Tracy, how does the art of the tease integrate with social media? Great question. Andy, Mike, how do you apply it? And Andy is a lot more socially aware than Mike and I are. He's kind of our
Well,
social media go-to on this.
ironic, that was one of my notes I was going to mention is because sometimes teasing can be a little intimidating for on-air talent, especially when they start out. And that's why some of them don't do it at all, or they just do really generic versions of it. But it's such an important skill to learn because it translates well to, I mean, obviously, like you said, you're driving instant TSL when you tease on air, but you can also, you'll find the verbiage is only slightly different. And sometimes you can use the exact same verbiage on social media to set that listener appointment and drive cume. So learning, it's such an important skill to learn because you can take it to the other platforms and use it to drive to set those listener appointments. The same goes for on stage. Like I can't tell you how many times I've seen people doing on stage intros in front of 10,000 people and they say nothing that drives back to the station to set a listener appointment. And it's like, you got a show tomorrow morning, man. You know what some of the things you're going to do on that show. Use that teasing skill we've taught you on air and use it right there on stage. You know.
Yeah,
So
some of the most effective shows we have are using their social assets really well and teasing ahead. And they also use social to generate some content for what they're doing on the air ahead of time, particularly phone bits. So don't overlook social as a resource for what you're doing on air. Ideally, digital and terrestrial kind of complement each other. I used to call it closing the loop, so that we're sending them back to the radio station, and then we're sending them back to our social assets as well.
Yeah, I think you can also learn a lot from studying social media. Social media companies spend a lot of time and money in figuring out how to get that click from social media to their website, where they can monetize that engagement that they have with their audience
in as few words as possible.
Yeah, that's right. They have limited time. Because everyone has limited attention spans. And so, and you can see what clickbait is. Clickbait is when it's something that's outrageous and over the top, and you kind of say, oh, why did I click on that? But the really good companies are clever, much like the cover of a magazine is clever, that gets you interested in seeing what that story is about on page 71. Upworthy is a really interesting website. They do on social media exactly what radio shows do on the air. They look for content that is happening somewhere else, put a brand on it, put their perspective on it, curate it, repurpose it, and then market and promote it as their own. Isn't that what we do on the radio every day? We find things that are happening around us and we turn it into fresh new content. But Upworthy has a team of writers that go all over the internet, and they look for interesting stories to rewrite. It takes an Upworthy writer 15 to 30 minutes to find and write a story. But before they can publish a story, they have to first submit 25 teases to an editorial board. They have to write 25 teases. It goes before an editorial board that meets once in the morning and once in the afternoon. They go through all of these stories and all of the teases. They narrow the teases to 10. Then the board votes on the 10 and gets it down to 3. Later that afternoon, they send an email to a portion of their database with a different tease for each story going out to see what gets the most clicks. That's what gets published the next day. They spend 15 to 30 minutes on the content and 24 hours on the tease. That's the importance of the tease, because if nobody gets to your content, you haven't really impacted anyone. So teasing is at least as important as the content, and you'll find a lot of media companies that are really studying this and working it on the internet and on social media are recognizing that. Another question, Y107 adds, I've been using a listener call with a little coaching to help set up a tease for big cash giveaways.
Love
That's
that.
great. That's a great entry point. And we're working with a couple of clients right now that are starting to use that, because one of the, and we're going to be doing this in an upcoming workshop too, about the handoff, that transition from coming out of a song and going into content, which is really awkward for a lot of personalities, of how you get there. So you've just played a Garth Brooks song, and suddenly you want to start talking about cats. I mean, how do you make that transition? So there's a handshake and then a transition into it, and you want to do that in a way that doesn't sound like you're that rude guy at a party who walks into a conversation and changes the subject. There's an art to do it, and that technique that you just described is one of the things that is really, really effective. If you can set up a listener to say, hey, thanks for listening to Y107 today. How are you doing, Andy? And Andy comes on and asks you a question that leads you into what you wanted to talk about. It can be absolutely terrific. There's another technique that you can use in teasing. If you're doing let's say you're doing a phone topic, and you've taken a couple of phone calls. Before you take the third phone call, get that caller on, have them say hello and say, you know what, I'm going to have to put you on hold. You got to hear what this story is all about. Let me just say this. It's about blank. Now you've made me taste it. It's like giving me a sample at Costco. I've got to get the full package. So that's also an effective technique.
Yeah, we have shows that have a serial benchmark, like I don't know, a second date update or whatnot, and you can take a very pivotal or interesting point from that and use that as part of your tease for the upcoming feature as well.
Okay, I've got one more question that is in the queue here, and if you have any more, okay, we got a couple more that I may have missed, but if you have any other questions, you can post them now on the chat room. Otherwise, we're going to wrap this up after answering a couple more here, but we'll stay on as long as the questions come in. So if you want to, just type it in the chat box and we will answer your questions. Question is, I'm struggling with a personality who thinks he knows a better way to format the morning show. He keeps stopping down to talk between songs, then segues into stop sets because listeners get used to hearing talk followed by commercials. So as soon as the talk starts, they know that they should tune out so they don't have to hear those commercials. What do you say to him?
Prepare a show further in advance.
When they start talking, they tune out. That's his premise, correct?
Exactly. That was my first thought.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So that's interesting. We're going to break up two songs to have some talk. That certainly telegraphs something right there.
Yeah, and if you're talking adds value, then it's not a tune out factor. That's the whole point of finding your angle and choosing content that you can actually add to. Is that talk is adding value. It's not a tune-out factor.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought when I saw this is, wait a minute, this guy is saying he doesn't want to talk into commercials because the audience will know commercials are coming up and they won't sit through his talk because of it. What does that tell you?
Right.
Maybe we have a content so he wants to put it between songs instead.
Right.
Something wrong with that logic. Bo Dalton, hey Bo, good to see you on. Says I write my teases, then walk around the building bouncing them off people. If they ask me to tell them what's the answer, I know it's a keeper. Great point. We use this technique. I learned this. I worked with a station in Detroit that was in a famous old building that was the ABC building back in the day when Jack Parr was doing his nightly Tonight Show before Johnny Carson. It shows you how old that was. And there were still some people working there that worked with Jack Parr at the time. And they said Jack Parr would come in at 7 o'clock in the morning and he would write his monologue for that night's show. And then he would just walk around talking to everybody in the building and practicing it with different facts. So he would walk up to somebody and say, you realize I took a cab to dinner last night and it cost me $7 to get there? Isn't that outrageous? And he'd see what kind of response he would get from the person. And then the next person he told it to, he would say it was $10. And he'd see if he got a different response. And he spent all day long walking around telling these same stories to different people. And he used different parts of his monologue for each. It was his show prep. And he could see how they responded if they kind of ignored him or acted like he was weird. And he would just fine tune that in his head all day. And by the time they went on to record the show that night, he was ready to go. It's a great technique, Bo.
Terrific.
Yeah, and if you're the further, not to keep beating the dead horse, but the further you work in advance, the more you can run that stuff by not only office work, you can run it by listeners at events if you're out on a remote. You know what I mean?
Yep.
You can also throw it up on social media. Write
That's
three
terrific.
teases,
Yes.
write three teases and put them out on Twitter at different times and see if you can start a conversation off the different teases and see which one ignites and which one doesn't. It's probably a better tease for the next day. Can you share your technique as to the order of the tease, like coming up next in the next hour, tomorrow, et cetera? Yeah, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of this. It's the shortcut. If you have content that's coming up after the next event, after this song, after this newscast, after this commercial, whatever, use next. That's coming up next after Dua Lipa on The Big Frog. If it's not next, but less than 10 minutes, tell me how many minutes away it is. That's coming up in 6 minutes. If it's more than 10 minutes, don't tell me how many minutes, because 13 minutes sounds like an eternity. 9 doesn't. If it's more than 10 minutes, but less than 15 or 20, timestamp it and say it's coming up at 7:26. By the way, you don't want to say at about 7:30 because nobody hears that language. It's so common that we keep hearing 7:30, 8 o'clock. So if you say it's at 7:26, it's 7:31, that gets heard better. So if it's more than 10 minutes, but less than 20, timestamp it to a specific time. If it's more than 20 minutes away, it better be really great content to be teased at all. And you'll want to put that into a different context. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be teased, by the way. It just means that it needs to be really good content or have strategic value to your brand in teasing it. And if that's the case, you can either timestamp it at a specific time or next hour at this time is good. And if you do that, then you want to associate it with what that listener might be doing at this time next hour. An hour from now, when you get to work, make sure you turn on the radio, because an hour from right now, here's what's going to be happening, that kind of thing. And then the other timestamp is tomorrow at this time, which is actually much more effective than most people give it credit for, which is another reason to plan your show further out in advance. If you know what you're doing tomorrow, Elvis Duran did this one time, and I'll never forget it. He was going into a phone topic about kids and about disciplining kids. And before he took the phone calls, he said, hey, you know what, tomorrow morning at this time, what would you do if your 4-year-old came home from daycare and said, I need a boyfriend and I need one now? That actually happened. Your calls on that tomorrow at this time. But right now we're talking about how you discipline kids when they misbehave. He just timestamped something, and he did it with content that was similar to what he was talking about now. So it was awesome.
Timestamp those social media posts too, when you're doing that the day before.
Yeah. But think about lifestyle too. To Tracy's point, coming on at 6:05 and teasing to 9 o'clock, unless it's really big, a lot of listeners, lifestyle wise, may not be able to listen to you then. I mean, listening patterns are different. So don't think that you can, stretch somebody or get somebody back if it's not going to fit into their natural lifestyle.
And Mike, that brings up a good point. A disturbing trend I've heard lately, and I don't know why it's making a comeback, but is what I call the multi-tease, where people come on, especially with their first break of the day, and they tease everything coming up on their show that day. And then sometimes they'll go an extra step and tease everything coming up on the other folks' shows later that day.
Yes.
Have you heard that, or am I the
I
only one
hear
hearing
that all the time, and it drives me crazy because it doesn't take into account the audience's experience and how I'm listening to the radio. It's your first break of the day, but it doesn't mean it's the listener's first break of the day. You just started your show. Who's that relevant to? Only to you. Right. It's not at all relevant to someone who was already listening and liking the station before you came on. And by the way, there's very few people who say, oh, you know what? It's 6 o'clock. I'd better turn on the radio because it's time for the morning show to start.
Right.
They don't listen the way that television shows do. And I think that teasing technique started when you watch TV, because television does a very good job of teasing. And a lot of times when a late night talk show comes on, they'll say, hey, we got a really big show planned tonight. We're doing this, and this. Well, it's a different viewer experience than the listening experience is to the radio. You're tuned in to watch something. And you're tuned in you're tuned in actively to watch something, as opposed to passively having the radio on in the background. So coming on with that laundry list at the beginning is really a complete waste of time. It doesn't.
Nobody's listening with a notepad taking notes.
Yeah.
And you talk about
Other than us. Yeah.
You talk
Right.
about conditioning an audience to tune out. They are completely conditioned to tune out when you start talking about things that I don't even know what I'm going to be doing at 8:30 this morning. Are you kidding me?
Right.
I'm gonna plan on tuning in your radio show at 8:30 this way. Sorry, I'll go get it on demand sometime. You know. Now, Andy mentioned multi-teases, and we call those stacked teases when we work with talent. And stack teasing can be very effective. You can tease 2 or even 3 things at one time. And there's some principles for stack teases that are good practices. You don't want to tease the same things. You don't want to tease 2 phone topics. You don't want to tease 2 contests. You don't want to tease 2 songs. Pick one, but you can then promote different things. Promote an information element, promote a phone topic, promote something funny. Now you've got a chance to hit 3 different types of audience interest at one time. So yeah, you can stack teases, but don't stack teases and tell me everything that you've got going on in the next 4 hours of your show. You still want to apply the what's coming up next, what's coming up in the next 10 minutes, what's coming up in the next 20 minutes. You still want to apply those principles as well.